Welcome to Run the Adventure, a podcast about getting the most out of your published modules for your tabletop role-playing game. I'm your host, Sid Razavi. Every episode, I take a look at a module to show you where the fun is and how you might want to tweak it to suit your game. I hope even if you decide not to play this particular adventure, you'll get a lot of interesting ideas out of it. The following content is aimed at games masters or players who want to be games masters. So if this is a module you are going to play as a player, this is the point when it's customary to warn you about spoilers. But if you're ready to step behind the screen, then there is absolutely no better time than right now to do so. I've been running games for over 30 years now, but my aim with every episode is to put myself in the shoes of a brand new GM. As well as breaking down the scenario and how it plays, I'll be peppering the discussion with useful advice for the relatively new GM who has to try to run this thing for their own group. I hope the discussion will prove interesting for veteran GMs as well, who are just looking for ideas for their games as well. Okay, now all that said, let me get to this episode's adventure. This time I'll be tackling the absolute classic, The Sunless Citadel by Bruce Cordell. Originally published for 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons in the year of our Lord 2000, this got a facelift for 5th edition back in 2017 as part of the Tales of the Yawning Portal hardback anthology of adventures. Frankly, this is one of the better published adventure books by Wizards of the Coast, at least for 5th edition, and I recommend the whole thing. The whole book is good. But today we're going to focus on the first adventure, which is aimed at a brand new player characters of level 1.
Summary of the adventure.
The premise of the adventure is that there once was a great fortress that fell and was swallowed into the earth. As these things tend to go, the place was swarmed by malevolent creatures and overgrown with fungi. At its heart, the citadel hides a secret, the Gulfius tree. The tree has drawn the druid Balak the Outcast, who becomes twisted by its promise of immortality. The source of this power is the fact that the tree has grown out of a wooden stake used to kill a great ancient vampire, Gulfius. The tree has captured some of Gulfius' essence. Its fruit is in turns restorative and rotten. The midsummer red apples offer health and vitality, whilst the midwinter fruit steals the life essence from the eater. Balak soon dominates a local goblin tribe who come to serve him, doing his bidding and spreading the fruit to the nearby village where the adventure starts. The fruit has the habit of spawning malevolent twig blights who cause havoc whilst also serving Balak. Worse than this, Balak has entrapped a group of adventurers who were sent to investigate the citadel. They became Balak's thralls thanks to the tree's necromantic power and now serve as his personal god. Now, the missing group of adventurers is one way the player characters are drawn to the adventure, thanks to a straightforward quest from a concerned relative in the nearby village. Other ways the party may be hooked to explore the citadel include the mystery of the strange fruits sold by goblins in town, or the creepy goings-on involving the local farm animals attacked by the twig blights. Finding the citadel is pretty trivial, as they stumble upon the ravine leading to it not far off a road leading from the starting settlement of Oakhurst. Then it's a matter of exploring the dungeon, dealing with its challenges and residing humanoids and undead until they find their way to the Twilight Grove for the final confrontation with Balak and the enthralled adventurers. In many respects, this is your classic dungeon crawl with a big bad evil guy to overcome. Yet, there is much to commend it over similar efforts. Firstly, the dungeon design is extremely well done, with traps and bottlenecks that make it really interesting to run encounters within. There is plenty of room for player agency in how they approach the place, with different areas offering exciting encounters and rich story elements that form layers giving texture to the whole main plot. The Citadel is a living dungeon with factions that have interests and lives independently of the PCs. Some clever use of NPCs at strategically important positions on the map make for meaningful role-playing opportunities that mix well with the exploration and combat on offer. With the presence of a young white dragon as a possible encounter, the Sunless Citadel ticks every box in what you may want from an introductory Dungeons and Dragons adventure. It does this without being necessarily softened for new players. That, in fact, may be what recommends this adventure to me personally, as a way of getting newer players to think through the consequences of their actions. To be cautious about possible traps, to not see every creature in a dungeon as something that must be killed for loot or XP, to try to make allies, to work out how to accumulate clues and unravel a story. This last point is really important to me for the kind of games that I run. In my games, players need to ask questions rather than assume everything will be handed to them.
Adventure structure.
Let's take a closer look at the structure of the module and how it is laid out. The module is presented in 4 parts. The first part provides the background summarized earlier about the history of the tree and Balak the Outcast. Part 2, the village of Oakhurst, provides the player characters opportunities to obtain their quests and return in the future for supplies, rest, and healing. The third part is the first level of the dungeon, where the PCs will spend most of their time. And the final 4th part is the second level of the dungeon, where the PCs will discover the wonders of the Twilight Grove and have the final encounter with enthralled adventurers and Balak himself. It follows a fairly traditional presentation approach of a keyed map, which mostly works at the table, although I have some recommendations later on in this episode on how you might want to make some preparations to help yourself when running the adventure and to make it a successful evening for you and your players. Now, the adventure's narrative structure plays out with the player characters starting off from Oakhurst and finding the Citadel, then finding the kobolds in their lair, then finding the goblins in their part of the dungeon, and finally finding the hidden grove and dealing with Balak and his retinue. Optionally, the player characters may encounter various undead, including an encounter with an undead troll creature who is actually a transformed elven dragon cult leader. It is up to the players whether they meet the goblins or the kobolds first. In both times I've run this for different groups, they happen to meet the kobolds first, and I think the path to the kobolds is a bit easier to get through. In any case, to get to the Twilight Grove, the party will need to go through the goblins' territory. And to get to the encounter with the undead, they have to find secret paths and open locked doors, which can be made a lot easier after meeting and dealing with the kobolds one way or another. A party of first-level adventurers may expect to level up a couple of times through the course of this adventure. In fact, I strongly recommend the party be given an opportunity to level up after the first few encounters with rats and goblins or kobolds, depending on which way they go through this. If they end up needing to rest in the dungeon at all, this may be a good opportunity to bump them up to second level. They've been bloodied a bit and should have mastered the basics of their class at this time. The extra hit points and spells will make a noticeable difference to their chances of surviving encounters later on, especially with the goblin leaders. It's also important to note that the deadliness of the dungeon is significantly higher for a party who chooses to fight their way through everything. For new players or those who are used to never dying in this newer edition of the game, this may come as a bit of a shock to the system. Dungeon Masters may use this as a teaching moment. The first time the party is looking like it will be completely wiped out, it might be a good idea to have a player characters get captured and put to work by the faction they are defeated by. Even if they are undefeated, you may press upon the players that not all the creatures they meet are hostile or by default hostile, or even capable of defending themselves against them. There are children of kobolds and goblins that live side by side with their warriors. Navigating such a complex social environment with non-humans is part of the challenge and fun of this adventure. Groups that show little or no nuance may rightfully come to a very sticky end. For example, the players are given ample opportunities to see the kobolds that are as amenable to diplomacy. The module is pretty famous for the inclusion of a dragon tamer kobold called Meepo, who you are encouraged to portray in a sympathetic way. I gave him a silly voice and made him quite pathetic. When the PCs meet Meepo, he is sad at the loss of his pet white dragon hatchling. The retrieval of this pet is something that will ingratiate the party with the kobolds and may even earn them a few kobold retainers to help them explore the dungeon. Players may balk at the giving of a dragon, a pretty dangerous beast, to the kobolds, in which case breaking the bad news to Meepo when the dragon is killed is a pretty acceptable outcome to maintain good relations with the kobolds. The dragon hatchling is a tough encounter in any case, and the players should be rewarded by the kobolds for at least not allowing the terrifying critter to remain in the hands of the goblins. Being neutral or friendly towards the kobolds gives the players a few really useful resources. Foremost amongst them is a place to rest and recover. This saves the party from having to exit the dungeon and return to Oakhurst every time they want to rest without interruption. Second, the kobold leader has the key and knowledge to help the player characters access the secreted away undead wing of the dungeon, where some valuable treasure can be found. As for the goblins, the players find themselves with an opportunity to pry away the goblins from their hobgoblin leaders, thanks to some internal resentments and dynamics going on within that faction. The concerns of the hobgoblins in charge rarely extend to the welfare of the goblin tribe, except as useful lackeys. The goblins find themselves under the thumb of Balak and his hobgoblin enforcers. As people who like strong, often brutal leadership, they generally appreciate what the hobgoblins can offer in terms of strength and protection. At least they are content to act as go-between Balak and the villagers of Oakhurst, earning a few gold on the side with fairly little risk. But they are less than happy to die for Balak or the hobgoblins. Given the chance, the goblins will make a deal with the player characters to save their skin. Of course, even parties who are not particularly bloodthirsty types may struggle with this module. The kobolds have numbers and the environment suits them defensively. It is unlikely they will overcome the PCs, even a level 1 party, unless the kobolds get pretty lucky. But they have places to retreat and can make exploration of the dungeon quite difficult. The hobgoblins, on the other hand, are very challenging, especially with the support of the goblins, even for a level 2 party. The run-up to the fight with the hobgoblin leader and the goblin shaman is through a series of choke points well suited to goblin ambushes. A party that pushes too hard, too fast, will find themselves depleted just at the moment the hobgoblins hit them with their really heavy damage. After the party has dealt with the goblins one way or another, they can find the way to the Twilight Grove. There they begin to unravel some of the mystery at the heart of this adventure and discover the Gulfius tree itself. The final encounter is a classic boss fight that needs to be handled with some care. Depending on how fresh the party is, you may wish to add more of the Twig Blight minions that spawn from the evil fruit before the party face the enthralled adventurers and Balak himself. On the other hand, if the party's capacities are already a bit depleted, you will need to take care not to overwhelm them. One approach is to have the combat happen in waves, with Balak or some of the enthralled adventurers holding back a bit until some of the threat is reduced by the PCs. If run well, this can be a very satisfying conclusion to the adventure. But to do this, the party needs to have some recognition of the enthralled adventurers to appreciate their ill fate. The fact the party may have run across some corpses and personal possessions of those adventurers of that party that didn't make it may aid in building up to this moment. Also, it's worth emphasizing the care of the quest giver NPC back in Oakhurst about her missing relative. If you can make her sympathetic, then you can bring sympathy to the fate of the adventurers in their current state. In one playthrough, one of my player characters had a personal connection to the family of one of the enthralled adventurers, and this worked beautifully to give them real motivation and care about what they were doing. Balix also provides a good opportunity to really play an evil character well, although I'm not entirely sure he is strictly alignment evil in this adventure. He's certainly twisted, and he makes it a great enemy to fight. He is intelligent and articulate, not some mindless monster that you can just reduce to spells and stats, at least not if played well. As the fight rages, Balak could be doing that favorite evil guy thing in the movies of monologuing the backstory in total denial of the peril he faces at the hands of these newly minted adventurers. After all, he's dealt with worse before. As written, Balak will try to give the player characters the opportunity to turn to his side with the promise of immortality. Not a completely useless offer, although obviously at a cost of losing their own free will, something he won't mention. Now, I'd be surprised, even with this hidden fact kept from the players, if many players take this offer up, especially when things are going reasonably well for them. So timing is everything with this offer if you're going to make the most out of it. It is best to give the offer early with some demonstration of the power of Balak and his little posse. If any of the NPC allies their party has accrued by this point still is alive, then have one of them killed really quickly as a first act before the fight really gets going. Then you can have Balak make his offer. You're still unlikely to turn a good party bad through Balak's offer, but if you can give the players a sense of having avoided temptation, the victory will taste a little sweeter to them. It is also a good opportunity to bring the Gulfius tree center stage in this scene, something that may prove a neat mechanism to weaken or defeat Balak if straightforward methods don't work for the PCs. Destroying the tree is an obvious move to weaken Balak, and how much you want to make of this depends on whether you have future plans for the tree or the spirit of the ancient vampire trapped inside it. In such cases, I like to give players a short-term tactical gain through use of such a MacGuffin, but at the cost of something long-term that will lead to more adventure opportunities. When it comes to the destruction of the tree, such powerful evil may not be so easily destroyed, or at least not without notice of its admirers. So, in summary, the adventure will typically follow a simple 3-act structure, with a potential epilogue with the undead troll, aka transfigured cult leader. The final proper act in the Twilight Grove is perhaps the most demanding to get right as the DM. But overall, the players will likely fall into a natural groove of the beats of this 3-act structure.
Where the fun is at.
The highlight of this adventure for me as the DM is this is a dungeon crawl done right. It has all the classic elements you would hope for. It has faction play, role-playing opportunities, some puzzles, and fun combat encounters that utilize terrain as well as monster abilities. For players, there is much to commend this adventure as one they will likely remember. From the entrance onwards, they get a sense of peril that never leaves them regardless of their growing competency and care in proceeding through it. It's not exactly a mega dungeon, but there is much to do, and yet it can be done in a satisfying, not too long amount of time. There is a clear logic to the place and to the inhabitants' lives. The role-playing opportunities here can be good fun if the DM is willing to embrace the larger-than-life caricatures on offer. Players will either love or hate Meepo, but either way he is a memorable character, as is Erky Timbers, the halfling acolyte who can be rescued from the goblins. The traps in the dungeon can be wonderfully memorable. I had one player who became infamous for how many pit traps he would fall into. He developed quite the phobia about pits after this. The combat encounters are a great opportunity for players to learn the combat system and their character's role within it. Teamwork can be fostered. Tactical thinking about positioning and strategic resource management are necessary for success. Personally, I recommend saving the undead troll, who is actually one of the dragon cultists that built the citadel, until after Balak is dealt with. Of course, this is partially up to the order the players choose to explore the dungeon. But presuming they don't butcher the kobolds and get the key from their leader by force, you have some control over when they get there. Your job then may be as simple as reminding them of the opportunity on offer as they wrap up the rest of the adventure. The kobolds will be grateful after the goblins are no longer the threat they once were. The kobold leader will likely hint strongly that this key belonged to the dragon cultists. After all, this is the reason these wannabe dragons moved into the dungeon in the first place. As such, this can make a really good hook into future adventures involving the cultists.
What doesn't work?
Firstly, from the perspective of the DM, this is almost an adventure that works as it's presented in the book, but not quite. It will require a bit of preparation to get ready for play. Firstly, this is an old-fashioned layout for adventures using a keyed map structure that doesn't make things as easy as it could be to prepare beforehand. Information about how to make the most of the kobolds and goblins is spread out throughout the keyed map entries. You need to think through the possible player actions and have an awareness of how different rooms interconnect to make the response from the humanoids interesting rather than static. If you come to the module cold, you are likely to be left wondering how various rooms connect or where the player characters are meant to be in the overall narrative. Now, in some old school adventures where there is no narrative, this may be working as expected, but this is a module written at the narrative turn in D&D, where there is in fact a story, a pretty decent one at that, one that will unravel as players explore the dungeon. Later module designs would take a more hybrid approach to breaking the adventure into narrative beats, whether that's scenes or events, alongside the keyed map format of older module designs. The Sunless Citadel, however, gives a synopsis up front of what this is all about, but really doesn't guide you through the keyed map, treating the dungeon in that old style. Therefore, I would recommend taking notes as you read the module for the first time, then putting together a couple of diagrams or bullet lists of how PCs may make their way through the dungeon to give you, as the DM, a sense of where the beats of this adventure lie. You may use flow diagrams or indented lists or scene cards, depending on your preference. Do whatever works for you, or if you're not really sure which one of these techniques to use, try one out and see if it works for you. It's very much a personal preference thing here. The format isn't as important as the act of taking what is a map database of locations with blocks of text and turning them into some kind of functional structure that makes it easy for you to think through how the players will approach the dungeon. What you're aiming to get out of such an exercise is some preparation for when the player characters are likely to meet the kobolds, especially Meepo, and the goblins. You also want to be aware of where the player characters can rest and recover before continuing on. Remember, this is an adventure for first level adventurers. It pays to be aware that there are opportunities for sounds and smells to filter through to the senses of the player characters in advance of them entering particular rooms. Perhaps the smell of the kobolds cooking, or the cries of Erky from his cage in that locked room. The play of the goblin children in the chamber can warn them that they're entering a social environment, not just a combat zone. And perhaps you'll hear the scolding of the hobgoblins who guard the leader's room, scolding one of the goblin servants, and that gives you a sense of the tension in the dynamics. These little hints, these auditory or olfactory hints of what's going on in the dungeon can really build color and make the dungeon come alive, but they can also help with the strategy of how players deal with things. If you can give your players the sense that this is a place that has a life, independent of them opening doors, it can build atmosphere and increase the players' appreciation that the creatures they encounter are not just tokens on a board waiting to be destroyed. Another criticism of the module as written is that many of the room descriptions and read-aloud text are pretty underwhelming. In fact, some space could have been saved by their omission, which would have made navigating through to the right place and during play a little easier. Look, I like evocative read-aloud texts that build atmosphere and stimulate all the senses. But descriptions that simply tell the players there is nothing there, for example, you can just omit that. I can say as much myself. By the time the PCs have dealt with the goblins, you're on to the home stretch and the adventure will likely run itself. Well, except for the final encounter. Now, boss fights can be a tricky business with D&D. Striking the balance between a memorable, challenging fight and one that either underwhelms the players or overwhelms the party is hard work. Nothing written on the page or considered before the adventure starts will likely hold up by the time the PCs actually get to this climactic fight. In my experience, you want to be prepared with options that can be brought in or cut from the fight based on the current state of the party. In other words, you want some dials you can fiddle with. Some will be pretty crude mechanisms like the resources available to the boss and his minions, but there are more nuanced tools available. In my opinion, simply increasing hit points is rarely a good move, as it just makes the fight last longer, but sometimes you'll want to do it because you don't want the boss to get one-shotted by a powerful spell or lucky crit. They might remember that for a minute or two, the players that is, but it's pretty unsatisfying for them, especially at the end of an adventure. However, this is rarely a concern with low-level parties. Likely, they're not going to be doing that kind of damage. Likewise, messing with the damage output is likely to put some player characters out of the fight early, which is not an ideal outcome either, although if it happens, it happens. Look, if bad luck can't end a player character, we're just pretending the dice matches. That may be fine for some tables for a while, but I think it's likely to have a pernicious effect long term, where any sense of danger or threat drains away from the game. Instead, I would dial up or down how smart the enemy turns out to be. Are they overconfident? Are they shrewd? Do they use their environment well? Do they ignore the heavy armored fool and go at the healer hiding in the back? Do they use their magic in the optimal way? Or do they wait too long to use their most powerful ability or blow too soon before the party is optimally positioned for them? Make the boss smarter, and you don't need to change a single stat to make this a much tougher encounter. Make the boss dumber, and the players will feel like heroes even in their weary state, holding on for dear life. If you're not sure how to make an enemy smarter or don't feel confident to do this on the fly, I recommend planning ahead. An exercise that may be useful is to write up a 2-column table with 1 column for smart and 1 column for dumb. Under the smart column, think of all the best moves the boss could make, the spells they should use, the way they would use the environment, who they should target. Then reverse that, find its polar opposite, and put it in the dumb column with the least optimal moves available. Then during play, you can decide which script to follow based on the circumstances of the party. You can even mix and match from the 2 columns as the fight develops. Maybe the boss starts really smart, but as fatigue of battle for both sides results in more dumb moves, or vice versa. The boss seems like it's about to doom himself from a party that turned out to be a lot more capable than you first thought. But like Forrest Gump or something, fortune smiles on him and he starts acting like a real badass. However you play it, pays to build a bit of flexibility into this kind of pivotal encounter if you really want to get the most out of it. I don't suggest you do this for every combat encounter in the game, but boss fights are a special case, and they're the kind of thing that can feel a bit of like a damp squib if not done right, or just disappointing, or frustrating in not the good way, not the kind of way that your players will want to come back to and really have another go at it. Whereas earlier encounters where, they're part way through the dungeon and they fail and they come back at it can feel like, okay, yeah, well, we'll give it another go. But the boss encounter, you typically either make it or you don't. If you fail, there's things you can do, obviously. You can build another story in it. There can be a recurrent theme. But if you want it to be really maximally satisfying, I think having some flexibility about how smart that boss and his minions turn out to be is really powerful and useful, at least when you're given the opportunity of dealing with a boss that isn't dumb. Finally, be aware this adventure was originally designed for early 3rd edition and converted to 5th edition without much consideration to the various character options introduced by later supplements in that edition. Dungeon masters may wish to be aware that some encounters and traps will turn out to be a bit of a non-affair with some of the capabilities available to PCs built using something like Tasha's. It may take some work to provide non-combat challenges to player characters who can all of them see perfectly in the dark or fly over pits.
How it played.
I've run this adventure twice all the way through. Once when 3rd edition was fairly new, I think around 2001, and more recently with a group using 5th edition rules. For the latter group, I used the version that came in the Tales of the Yawning Portal hardback adventure anthology. This is a decent conversion except for the absolutely useless maps in the book. You will want to dig up the old module or find some maps online that are actually legible. In either case, we had really memorable experiences, and it played really well for both groups. All the major beats were hit, and both parties were suitably challenged throughout. What substantive differences existed, I think, was due to the expectations of the players and their prior experience with D&D. The 3rd edition group had been playing AD&D 2nd edition for quite a few years beforehand and were only new to the 3rd edition. They went on a journey of learning the new rule system, and I think it was a successful outing for that purpose as well as great fun on its own terms. They were old hands at exploring dungeons, their grasp of tactical combat was pretty sound, they had all played together before and already worked well as a team. They took the obvious route of allying with the kobolds, the goblins were drawn into a series of ambushes, turning the terrain against them after that initial surprise the goblins lay for them. What I don't remember, given how long ago this was the encounter with Balak. I suspect it wasn't that memorable. But 20 years is a long time, so who knows for sure. The 5th edition group made many of the learning mistakes you'd come to expect, as they were a little greener with D&D in general. There was one highly optimized character who trivialized a few of the traps and encounters, but for better or for worse, that player didn't turn out to be a regular to the group. However, that aside, the party struggled with combat encounters with the hobgoblins the first time round. There was a near total party kill with just one PC surviving to form a new party and return to the Citadel. That made the second incursion into the dungeon even more satisfying and fostered a level of teamwork that the group continued to build on. The hobgoblins still proved to be challenging, so did the undead, zombified ex-party members I added as an additional encounter roaming the corridors. It provided a really neat opportunity to hint at some of Balak's power and the fate of those who fall under it. The final fight, I think, went well and proved the right level of challenge for a party growing in confidence and ability.
Make it your own.
Now let's consider how you can make Sunless Citadel work for your table. Firstly, the obvious first question is how to place it in your setting. The 5th edition module is written and set in the Forgotten Realms, but there really isn't much here that would make it difficult to transplant to some other setting. The village of Oakhurst is fairly generic, some may even say bland. It could easily be replaced with another starter town. Personally, my favorite published starting places for an adventuring party are the village of Homlet, plus the towns of Saltmarsh and Threshold. I'll hopefully cover the modules where these places are presented in a future episode. But for now, let me say that what makes these starter settlements special is they are ready to go with adventure seeds. Saltmarsh particularly stands out as being filled with wonderful non-player characters who have their own agendas, motivations, and personal dynamics for the PCs to navigate, investigate, and make the most of. Hamlet, Saltmarsh, and Threshold are the kinds of places your party will want to come back to time and time again for new adventure hooks and to resolve long-running plots. What makes them particularly effective is the growing familiarity the players will gain with them over time. Familiarity builds up the party's caring about a place. Getting your PCs to feel like they belong somewhere can be a real great motivator for meaningful adventures that matter. So in that regard, Oakhurst leaves a lot to be desired. To get the adventurers off to explore the Citadel, they'll probably do as it is written, but some DMs will want to flesh out the NPCs and locations a bit if they want to make it a hub for future adventures, or simply move the adventure to some other place that you care about. As it happened in both my playthroughs, Oakhurst was somewhere my party didn't stay around too long in any case. It suited the kind of campaign that was more focused on traveling across the land from town to town. Just another unremarkable place in need of heroes. The dynamics of a campaign where the party is rootless to one where they set down some routes is very different. Both can be a lot of fun, and it's up to you as the DM to decide which suits your current game. There are 3 other aspects of the module that offer hooks into a wider campaign, should the DM wish to make use of them. Firstly, within the dungeon itself is a really long, unmapped tunnel that can lead to the Underdark or some other equally foreboding location. This tunnel is placed at a pretty awkward moment in the adventure, as the players are likely to spot it well before they have concluded the adventure proper. If you want them to pursue that avenue at a later date, you'll need to heavily signpost it without making it so attractive as to divert them from the quest they're currently on. One way to do this is to show them the tunnel, but if the player characters go down it, have them find that it seems to go on for a very long time without much change or anything of interest. Then, later on, when the players meet some of the final NPCs, you can hint that the tunnel leads to the next adventure. Perhaps Balak is in the process of making a deal with some drow, or perhaps the goblin shaman tells of a valuable black opals that have been found deeper in the tunnel. Or you could have one of the NPC allies of the party, provided they've survived that long, grabbed by something and taken deep into the tunnel. With the immediate threat of the Balak and his minions dealt with, the party may have good reason to explore the tunnel. I'd be cautious of over-relying on this hook, though, or appearing to force the party down a particular path like this. Leave it open as a possibility with enough detail mapped out to run an encounter or two, or role-play out the scene of their exploration if they surprise you by promptly pursuing the opportunity. But only get into the larger details when you know you have them on the hook. The next possible element you might want to take forward is the Gulfias tree itself. There is some fantastic lore associated with this available on the net. I'll put a link to this in the show notes if you're interested. This ties the vampire Gulfias of Nightfang Spire to the red dragon Ashadalon, whose image has graced various D&D starter set boxes in the past, as well as a rules light board game with his name on it. There are further links to Barovia of Ravenloft and Curse of Strahd fame as well. To make the most of this, you will need to make the players interested in what the tree is beyond the simple process of stopping the evil fruit in Balak. Balak could be the key to doing this if he hints at his power. However, it's more likely you will need to introduce something outside of the module that refers to the Gulthias tree. Perhaps a book with the lore written in it, perhaps a wandering scholar researching a fruit that grants immortality or opens portals to the Shadowfell, hears of the party, and wants to be taken to the tree. Or perhaps the dragon cult, which Gulthias started, will play a more prominent role in the PC's lives after this adventure. This brings in the third element that can make this adventure the start of a campaign centered around the dragon cult. One approach that I took was to have the Sunless Citadel linked directly to the Cult of the Dragon of the Tyranny of the Dragons modules. In particular, if their party defeats the undead troll that once was a cultist leader, they can discover an item that will prove useful in their struggle with the cult at a later point. However, I should be frank that, like many others, I found Tyranny of Dragons a difficult module to love, and my group disbanded before we could make a lot of progress into that campaign. It is not a module I will be recommending here. Although there are some elements in it that I think could be lifted if you are playing a campaign in the Forgotten Realms, I wouldn't say that this is worth the money to buy it just for that. It just happened that I bought it when it was the only published module available for 5th edition. Regardless, the cult is an obvious plot device for future adventures. Surviving members of the cult may want to know where the Gulthias tree is located, or seek vengeance if the party destroyed it. How strong the cult turns out to be in the present age can be dialed up and increase the pressure they put on the party. For example, you might want to make some brief encounters with agents of the cult in some future unrelated adventures that are focused on other goals. Then, when finally the cult has become too much of a thorn in the party's side, or vice versa, you bring about a confrontation with a mid-sized conclave of the cult. This can eventually lead to dealing with the cult's leaders themselves. Of course, this then opens up opportunities to bring dragons into play, and we all know everybody loves dragons. Now, for the DM who takes a look at this with a view of only taking some elements for their own adventures, I'll limit my advice to 3 main suggestions. Firstly, the module has a few very memorable NPCs that can be great motivators and help for the party of green adventurers, especially those who are new to the game. Meepo is perhaps a bit cutesy for some taste, but I've been lucky to play with players who immediately took to seeing this supposed monster as a potential ally. It's a good opportunity to test your voice as a DM and do a light bit of acting in play if that is something you haven't tried before. Urki Timbers is equally a good device for getting the players an ally, particularly if they are a bit light on healing. First level parties are very vulnerable to swings, and I think this was more true with 3rd edition than it is with 5th edition, but still is probably somewhat true for 5th edition, despite how many avenues of healing there are. The changes of fortune, depending on how the dice roll in the day, can really make or break a party. So offering the party some extra support early on is a good tactic for making first level adventures fun while still remaining somewhat challenging. Urki and Meepo are never going to outshine the PCs, and that's really important, but they can provide a little something, whether that is one more chance to hit a goblin or a little bit of healing during the fight. They make good models for your own NPC helpers. Secondly, the terrain of the Citadel is something that is really carefully done and provides plenty of hints for making challenging encounters. A couple of goblins are not much for a modest-sized party of, say, 4-player characters. But give them cover, a choke point lined with caltrops, and play on their ability to hit and run, and they become a real menace. This brings out the wider, important philosophical question of why certain monsters inhabit the environment they do. Too often it seems like monsters just happen to be in their locales without any care as to why they moved in there in the first place. As a DM building your own adventuring sites, you have to always ask, why here? Why did the monster decide this was the place to make its home? And in a dangerous world, no sentient creature, especially those who live through violence, would make a home without some care as to how to defend it. The attention to detail in the Citadel is even better than this, of course. There are obvious locations for all the full life cycle of the kobolds and the goblins. The PCs can see where they sleep, eat, and shit. They are aware there are children about. The kobolds and goblins act intelligently, but true to their own cultures. Yes, the goblins follow the strong hobgoblins, but they're not going to throw their lives away when the tide has turned against them. In short, the creatures in the Citadel, at least those with a mind, are not just waiting to be destroyed by wandering adventurers. There are great examples of level design in this dungeon that can be lifted and placed into your own dungeons to give them a sense of being lived-in spaces. Finally, the adventure provides a good balance between linear and open play, which is great especially for new players, but also fun for experienced players. Now, everybody hates to be railroaded, at least after they learn what that term means. Although I sometimes think that for new players whose only experience of role-playing games is on the computer, this may not be so unwelcome. They often do appreciate knowing exactly what to do next to get to the next endorphin rush of accomplishment. But most players who've played a bit and got themselves into the hobby, they want a sense of their own agency to affect the story. If plot point B always inevitably follows plot point A, then the players can often disengage or leave the game entirely. Yet, open world or sandbox adventures can be equally challenging to get right. Give players no options or even too many options and they will end up stuck, not knowing what to do or just end up choosing randomly. Preparing a plethora of options can be a challenge for a DM as well. There are techniques to overcome both challenges, and I will perhaps touch upon them in a future pod. But for many groups, having a few hooks into the adventure is the best way to go and get to the fun. And getting to the fun is paramount. What fun is may vary for different groups, but for many, exploring a dangerous environment and overcoming challenges, often through combat, is at the heart of it. This is what makes dungeons such a great environment for a fantasy RPG, especially for new players. The players know exactly what they are doing, but good design means giving them lots of different ways of doing it. The level design in the Sunless Citadel means players have several paths they could explore. The encounter designs means they have several ways to overcome the challenges. Combat is always an option, but other options are available, and in fact, often preferable. One measure of this is how many alternative endings are possible. There are at least 2 different factions the party could encounter first or ally with. Factions who are at war with each other. The party may even throw in their lot with Balak, although that seems pretty unlikely. They may meet the undead creatures early on, or at the very end, or maybe not at all. All in all, the players have choices despite the limited size and the tight focus of the adventure. Events don't simply happen to them. I think this is a lesson worth considering when designing your own adventures.
And finally...
Well, that brings this episode to a close. I hope you've enjoyed it. Overall, I think the Sunless Citadel is one of the best starting adventures for D&D available. There is a lot for the budding DM to use and learn from. Experienced DMs will be hard-pressed to find a more satisfying dungeon crawl in print. It is almost ready to run as printed with interesting locations, smart encounters, and memorable NPCs. You will have a good time with a little bit of effort. With a bit of work and foresight about how to position it into a larger campaign, it may turn out to be one of the favorites with your group. Thank you for listening to Run the Adventure with me, your host, Sid Razavi. I'd love to hear any feedback, questions, or your thoughts on this episode. You can reach me on email, gm@runtheadventure.com, or find me on Twitter at RTA_podcast. I'll put that in the show notes so you can find it easier. If you liked what you heard, please do consider leaving a rating or review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or wherever you found this pod. It'd be really lovely to get the word out about this. Even better, please share the pod with your friends and on social media. Links to today's adventures are available in the show notes as well and on the website. That's www.runtheadventure.com. Again, also on the show notes. Okay, until the next episode, may your next adventure run fantastic.